Okay, it's working now. You can go ahead, Sean.
Okay, terrific. Thank you all so much for joining this evening. I'm so flattered and pleased to be joined by countless and highly distinguished faith leaders. I'm here to convene. I'm here to learn, and I hope we provide something of value. We've put this together tonight because the nation desperately needs moral leadership right now. Not just from the president, not just from members of Congress, not just from the pulpit, but from every one of us as Americans. And as we think about what that leadership needs to look like, I think we need to reflect on the fact that our foundational myths, our foundational documents, the heroes who we lionize have all fused our national ideology with Scripture. And while the moral underpinning of those documents is beyond reproach, there is a real danger there. There's a danger because, in my experience, religion is what politicians talk about when they don't want to talk about ethics. That's why separation of church and state matters, because it's too easy for the vices of one to infect and corrupt the virtues of the other. I don't know how to do my job, a job that requires mutual tolerance of all faiths and creeds, if I start by insisting that there is a singular, divinely revealed and unassailable truth. But on the other side, we're governed by fallible mortals who were elected by fallible mortals. And when we assert divine providence into our elections, I think we inevitably compromise the moral clarity of religion as those folks' faults become evident. So why today? Today, because after 9/11, after Pearl Harbor, as a country, we came together against an enemy from without, an attack from without. We rallied around those foundational myths, that foundational morality, and we emerged maybe a little bit less innocent, but also we emerged a little stronger. What happened on January 6th was different. The only analog in our history was Fort Sumter. We were attacked from within. We still have to rally together, but we don't really have a playbook. We don't know how to do it. And so the challenge that we have is, how do we come together in this moment? How do we come together in unity, with love, with solidarity, against an attack from within, against a moral outrage from within? Now, the lesson there, going back to how all those foundational texts emerged, I think comes from a recognition that all of our great religious texts teach tolerance and teach unity. What is Exodus if not a mandate to respect the dispossessed? Matthew says, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. Mohammed says, give glad tidings to strangers. And frankly, all of our secular moralists teach the same thing. All men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, with malice towards none and charity for all. I have a dream that my children will be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. All of these things that inspire us, things that make us proud to be Americans, are messages that remind us of our common humanity, not those little things that divide us. And yet, our country has never really reconciled our original sin, nor has it really reconciled the religious rhetoric that was used to sustain it. And it hasn't reconciled that not because we're bad people, not because religion is flawed, but because we as frail, fragile people have a really, really hard time telling our relatives, telling our neighbors, telling our loved ones that they're on the wrong side of an ethical line. So as I said at the start of this, the analog here is Fort Sumter. And in the years leading up to the Civil War, I think the clearest moral voice that was out there was Frederick Douglass. And he was deeply informed by religious texts. He was deeply informed by our founding documents. And he made it very clear which side of that he was on. Douglass, before the Civil War, said, the slave auctioneer's bell and the church-going bell chime in with each other, and the bitter cries of the heartbroken slave are drowned by the religious shouts of his pious master. Your praise and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. As I said, he took sides. Abraham Lincoln met him. Abraham Lincoln heard him. Abraham Lincoln agreed with him. But when Abraham Lincoln had to put those words in the president's mouth, he chose unity over moral clarity. Lincoln's second inaugural, a beautiful document that was hugely informed by his meetings with Frederick Douglass. What did he say there? He said, "It may seem strange that any man should dare ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, but let us not judge, lest we be judged." So here we find ourselves today, the day after Martin Luther King's birthday, the day before a presidential inauguration, 2 weeks removed from an attack on our nation's capital by many, some who use the language of religion while carrying Confederate flags and wearing Camp Auschwitz shirts. Here we find ourselves today trying to figure out how to come together in the name of morality and decency and kindness. And here we find ourselves today trying to do what Abraham Lincoln couldn't, but knowing that we must. Now, I believe that we can, but I think we only can if we work across our political and our religious and all our other divides. And that's why we tried to get as diverse a group as possible here today. A group of faith leaders who understand that linkage between those foundational legal political documents and the scriptural underpinnings behind them. And it's why I'm so proud to turn the balance of this program in a moderation role to Ed Stetzer, the Billy Graham Distinguished Chair of Church Mission and Evangelism at Wheaton College, a college, I should point out, that was founded by abolitionists and was clearly on the right side of that original sin. And no less importantly, someone who has spoken and written with great eloquence and humility about the nexus of faith and politics. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Ed.
Well, thank you, Congressman, and thank you for those of you who are joining us. Let me invite you. You're watching probably on Facebook Live. Let me say first, too, if our tech team can, as people speak, highlight the individual speaker view, that might help people to see a little more easily on Facebook. But if you are watching on Facebook Live, let me encourage you to take a moment to like and to share. Congressman Casten, thanks for reaching out across aisles, inviting people of different faiths and backgrounds here to your page. There's many areas we agree. I'm sure there's areas we don't agree, but there's areas where all Americans should agree. And on a day when we are memorializing 400,000 deaths from a pandemic, when our transition of power looks stunningly bizarre to us as we see troops all around our inauguration ceremonies, our nation's deeply divided, yet we can and we should still talk about faith, even on the pages, the web page, the Facebook page of a congressman. And so thankful that you would have us to this conversation. You probably haven't heard my name before our conversation, but I know yours, Congressman, because I pray for you. It's actually part of my faith commitment. It's taught in the scriptures that I would pray for our leaders, and I do pray for you. And of course, none of us wants to see our faith misrepresented, yet it has been on the news much, particularly my faith, to see people pray in Christ's name on the floor of a breached Senate or House is a stunning and heartbreaking reality. And yet I do indeed believe in divine providence. I believe in the place of Christians and people of faith in politics, and also people of no faith and people of other faiths in politics. And speaking, there's different traditions even represented here, and we'll hear from people of different religions and different backgrounds because we share a common nation. And if we're going to together walk and share this space in this nation, we're going to have to learn to live one another, build bridges with one another, respect one another, and more. Now, I should say for the Christian traditions here, we do indeed believe Jesus' death on the cross and for our sin and in our place, and his resurrection gives us meaning to our lives and to the world. So we can't leave that behind in conversations even like this. And it's an evangelical conversation as well. As an evangelical, that's a kind of a subset of the grand Christian tradition. It would be a mistake to push aside the fact that many evangelicals were seen and were pointed out and have been discussed widely in the news as part of some of the heartbreaking realities we saw last week. But let's also remember that there's different kinds of people here, right? There are people who are very pleased with the outcome of the election. There are people who are disappointed in the outcome of the election, half the country in some ways. Many of those who are disappointed were in the tradition where I am, evangelicals who who thought they made the best decision, not from malice, but because they felt it was the best decision they could make in that voting booth. And they're all over this district and all over this country. So there's that subset of people who may be disappointed. And then there was a subset of those people who believe erroneously that the election was stolen. And then there's a subset of them that went to Washington, and many people marched, and many of them were Christian, and lots of them were evangelicals, and they protested and they prayed, and that is their right. Nobody here or anywhere should say that was not their right to protest and to pray. But then there was a subset of them, and there were those who breached the Capitol, and there were many in those cases who were influenced by conspiracy theories, and they were, as Mitch McConnell said today, provoked by the president. And in doing so, we saw as Christians symbols of our faith, or actions of our Christian faith, or expressed Christian faith at least, when they prayed in the Senate chamber and they prayed in Christ's name, but they used his name in vain. So I'm thankful that Congressman Casten reached out, and you will hear from some evangelicals tonight. Not everyone will be an evangelical, but again, evangelicals are a type of Christian that to us, we want the whole world to know about this king we follow. Perhaps our favorite Bible verse is John 3:16. It says, God so loved the world that he sent his only son, that whoever would believe in him would not perish, but have everlasting life. We believe that, and we wish that people would know us for that, but that's not what they're talking about today. That's not what people are talking about on the news today about evangelicals, hence tonight. So don't misunderstand. When Congressman Casten invited me and invited faith leaders, and the first few will actually be people of evangelical faith and tradition, it's because he is watching the same news that I'm watching and that you're watching, and his desire and my desire and our desire is that you might know that that's not to be done in our faith's name. That's not to be done in the name of our God. Now, you'll also hear people from other faiths because we share a common concern about the nation. You'll hear from people of no faith because we share a common concern about this place where we dwell and live together. So in this moment in our country's history, Christians are praying, people of different faiths are praying, people of no faith are concerned and worried, and perhaps they should be. This is the most divided it has certainly been in my lifetime, in the midst of a global pandemic that's the greatest crisis of our lifetime, in the midst of economic challenges that are sweeping across this district, across Illinois, and across the country. And in the midst of all of the division, the question is, where are people of faith, and how are people of faith to respond? So tonight, I'm glad to bring to you, along with the congressman, some faith leaders. Now, again, I want to say to you, you're going to hear first from, and Representative Casten will actually introduce them, but you'll actually hear first from a couple of other evangelicals. Now, evangelicals represent, well, depending upon who's counting, somewhat 25% of people of faith and identify in the country, maybe 25 or more percent in the country, a little less here in our district, but still a significant number of people. And you're going to hear from them, but that's not everyone in the district. Again, there's people of other faiths and no faith and different faiths. But right now, it's evangelicals that are in the news. So thank you for your patience when you'll actually hear from a couple of other evangelicals who, like me, are deeply concerned about our symbols and our faith being misused by those who breached the Capitol this last week. So let me turn it back to Representative Casten, who will introduce our guests. Each of them will have the opportunity to speak, and he'll kind of go through, and again, there'll be a couple of evangelicals and people of other faiths as well. And then I'll come back later to help lead our discussion. So again, Representative Casten, thanks so much for the opportunity to share and for you inviting faith leaders to this conversation. I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Stetzer. Our next expert panelist is Dr. Michael McCoy. Dr. McCoy is the Assistant Professor of Politics and International Relations at Wheaton College, received his doctorate from Princeton University, and his work is centered on international conflict in Middle East politics. Dr. McCoy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Representative Casten, for putting this together, for inviting me. I also would just like to thank Will Barrett, a former student of mine who works in Representative Casten's office, who reached out to me. I'm very appreciative, and I'm glad to talk today about what at least for our country, again, speaking as a Christian, speaking as a political scientist, is perhaps the most important issue we could be looking at. I think at times like this, there can be a temptation to claim that those who do wrong are not true members of one's group, especially when those members have, in our eyes, violated some sacred principle or principles. Yet many of those who attacked the Capitals proclaimed a faith in Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, just as I personally do. So I cannot ignore that, nor should anyone else who makes that proclamation of faith. So we are left to explain to ourselves and to others what happened. Or as the event title asks, how did we get here? The Trump evangelical connection has been much reported on and analyzed throughout the Trump era, so there may be no new revelations here. But I think it's still important to reiterate some of the thoughts that have been expressed. Evangelical support for Trump, which started as reluctant backing and ended among many as an enthusiastic embrace, came from what I've seen and from conversations I have had over the years from three factors. Number one, a genuine agreement with him about an idealized America and what it should look like. Number two, an anger over what many saw as the loss of cultural power. And number three, fears that the loss of that cultural power would be followed by the loss of political power. And with that loss of political power would then result from that growing marginalization and maybe even persecution. Hence, you see in a lot of these discussions, when evangelicals are asked to explain their support for Donald Trump, you'll note an emphasis on confirming conservative judges in order to provide some level of trustworthy political protection. Note the resonance of the phrase, make America great again, this vision of America back when it embraced values that many conservative evangelicals felt familiar with. And even the resonance of the phrase, stop the steal, as I was thinking about this recently, and I get the sense that when we talk about the steal, when there's this comment about stopping the steal, it's not only just talking about the theft of an election or the supposed theft of an election, but also the theft of a cultural presence that many felt that they once had and now again feel marginalized, a sense of stolen American culture. I would say Trump spoke to those fears and he spoke for that anger. And thus what others condemned about him as rudeness, there were many evangelicals who saw him as a defender against a culturally imposed political correctness. What others condemned as his bullying, many evangelicals saw as necessary to defend those interests, to defend their interests. I feel almost compelled at this moment to say that is not necessarily the way I viewed the president. I had strongly different views on how I viewed the president, but I aware of many who had those feelings and had that view of him. And yet, for me, and I know for many other evangelical Christians, we turn to what the Bible teaches, specifically in the epistle by the Apostle James, that human anger cannot bring about the righteousness of God. And I think that has become especially evident in the past few weeks when many use the name of Jesus to sanction and validate lies. And I think it's important to use that word. Not misinformation, not disagreement, lies about our democratic process. And then to use Jesus' name to bless a violent assault on our Capitol, our elected representatives, and our police. So again, we ask, how did we get here? For so many of us as Christians, how did we go so far astray from our professed Christian values? I would personally answer that is because we stopped believing, or perhaps we never believed, that our Christian values should guide our political actions. As Representative Casten said, that even as Christian principles are present within many of the founding documents of the United States, while many proclaim that certain policy aims are to be Christian, you'll find among many Christians, if you talk to them and ask them about this, that there's more skepticism that Christian values are the best way to pursue those aims. And I would say that Jesus' words and his example are clear. Be kind to your neighbor. Be hospitable to strangers. Love your enemies. In my politics class at Wheaton College, I talk to students and I call this Jesus' threefold call to love the neighbor, the stranger, and the enemy. And yet to many Christians, if you remind them of these commands, they will claim that these are only private virtues and aren't meant for public political life. In fact, President Trump himself declared at the National Prayer Breakfast just last year that when Arthur Brooks talked about the importance of loving your enemy, President Trump responded by saying he disagreed that we should love our enemy and love our enemies, and then once again listed the many grievances he had against others. And I can't help but wonder how many Christians listened to the president and silently agreed with him. Yet if we are Christians, then Jesus calls on us on the Sermon on the Mount to be salt and light in the world. But if our Christian virtues are merely private, if we fail to be salt and light, then we will be called into account as our society becomes darker and more rancid. As Representative Casten noted yesterday, we celebrated Martin Luther King's birthday, and so it's fitting that I somewhere fit in a quote from him and remind us of his warning that power without love is reckless and abusive. Nevertheless, I want to end my initial remarks here by noting that the so-called Trump era also helped to highlight the much ideological diversity within the American Christian community. While evangelical support for President Trump received much of the national attention, other voices loudly made themselves known. From conservative evangelical never-Trumpers like Michael Gerson and Peter Wehner, to prophetic progressive voices like Bernice King and William Barber. People like Beth Moore and Russell Moore, no relation to my knowledge, speaking from within the Southern Baptist Convention, to leaders like my friend and Wheaton Associate Chaplain Raymond Chang, who this year helped found the Asian American Christian Collaborative. The Christian community is not uniform in its political beliefs, nor should it be, nor frankly has it ever been. But we must be uniformly committed in Christ's command to love. For as he said to his disciples the night before he was executed, love one another, for by this they will know you are my disciples. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. McCoy. And I apologize. I'm seeing some comments that my audio is a little bit soft. I'm hoping you can hear me okay.
I can hear you, Sean. You're good.
Okay.
You sound good to me.
Terrific. Okay. Want to now introduce Dr. Amy Peeler. Dr. Peeler is the Associate Professor of New Testament at Wheaton College. She's also the Associate Rector of St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Geneva. She received her doctorate in biblical studies from Princeton Theological Seminary in 2011. We seem to have a lot of Princeton graduates here. Dr. Peeler, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm really honored to be included and thankful. And I sense that my role here is to reiterate much of what has been said, a sense of ownership for Christians in this event, and a sense of clarity. And I think if we can establish that, then we can move toward this unity of which you spoke at the beginning, Congressman Casten. Thank you. Well, my background, I was raised as a Southern Baptist in Oklahoma, and my present vocations as both professor and pastor acquaint me with many different kind of evangelicals, just as Michael was speaking of. So I speak this evening from my professional expertise, but I speak for myself. I can't represent all. But as a scholar and a pastor, it does seem incredibly clear to me that no one who claims to follow the life of Jesus as laid out in the New Testament could ever conduct or support violence done in his name. Now, I'm fully aware that this has happened throughout history and that it happened on Wednesday, January 6th, and this has left me feeling crushed with grief. I would like to offer a few reasons why such violence, specifically the insurrection at the Capitol, is incommensurate with, and in fact blasphemous to, the name of Christ. So I'm drawing here from my perspective of someone who spends most of my days studying the history and documents of the New Testament. Those actions at the Capitol, it seems to me, were motivated ultimately by fear. And actions conducted in the name of Jesus Christ should instead be motivated by trust. Now, I realize that many have bought into Trump's completely baseless claims that the election was stolen. But even the willingness to believe that vast conspiracy theory arises from a deep fear of what could happen if Trump is not in power. But Christians are consistently and clearly instructed to leave everything in the hands of God, who has complete sovereignty. Taking actions into one's own hands in the way shown at the Capitol displays a complete lack of trust in God. And second, the intent of those actions at the Capitol was to cause harm to property, and most horrific, to cause harm to human beings. The Christians, conversely, should be willing to endure harm. I think of the early followers of Jesus as laid out in the Acts of the Apostles. They're prime examples. They were willing to be beaten and to be arrested for their proclamation that Jesus was king, but they were never given license to inflict harm. Jesus says to his followers to turn the other cheek if they are struck, and this is to follow his own example. He did claim to be king, Messiah, but he did not exert that kingship by fighting the Romans with an army, but instead by willingly giving up his life on a Roman cross. And I'd like to note here that this is one of the primary reasons why I, from the moment that Trump appeared on the national scene, greatly opposed him. For it seems that he and the movement that he has encouraged idolizes strength. America first. Never bend the knee to anyone. With crass words and thoughtless actions, get your way at any cost. Never compromise. Any display of weakness elicits not compassion, but disdain. Seems to me that this is a toxic masculinity that stands as the exact opposite of the way of Jesus, who leads by serving, who profoundly values all people, who says that true strength is found in the weakness of depending upon a truly all-powerful God. Now, I'm grateful to report that, in fact, all of the Christians with whom I'm in conversation, and admittedly, this is just a slice, but all of those Christians, including those with whom I adamantly disagree because of their willingness to have voted for Trump, all of them actually share a horror of what happened at the Capitol on that Wednesday. Seems to me that that subset that Ed was speaking of, that group who was willing to carry out those actions, they were willing to use the name of Jesus to conduct violence. They were not following the lead of faithful Christians. Even those who disagree about political policies, they were following the lead, it seems, of Trump himself, who was given evidence that he can hold up a Bible. But I have to admit, I have never seen evidence that he has ever submitted himself to its clearest teachings. As an educator in both the classroom and from the pulpit, I have done a great deal of soul searching as to how this could be possible that many who claim the name of Christian have fallen into this idolatry of strength manifest in this person, Donald Trump. I will remain committed to continuing the long, hard, patient work of studying the Bible and teaching it, I hope, with clarity and truth and grace, in the hopes of freeing some from that idolatry, exposing areas of idolatry in my own life. But in addition to that teaching done inside Christian circles, such public violence calls for public proclamation. And so I'm very grateful for an event such as this, which gives opportunity for all faith leaders, but especially Christians, since it was our signs at the Capitol, to disentangle faith and, for Christians, disentangle the name of our good Lord from this ugly, fearful, and selfish violence. I look forward this evening to learning more ways to conduct this disentanglement, to move forward, hopefully, in good faith and in unity. Thank you for the invitation, and I anticipate with great hope the conversation that will unfold.
Well, let me say thank you to Drs. Peeler and Drs. McCoy. And if you're just tuning in tonight, you might be a little surprised to be having a Bible study on Representative Casten's Facebook page, but there's a reason for that. And if you're just tuning in, we're having a conversation about faith and how we got here and the Capitol breach and more, and maybe ways forward together. And the Congressman has invited us to have this conversation, and in doing so, you've first heard from three people from Wheaton College. I happen to lead the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center, and then professors in another area. Let me again mention that having three people from Wheaton College to begin a conversation is probably not without controversy for Representative Casten. Certainly not without controversy for me to be here as well. But we think it is an important opportunity to discuss ways forward. We don't represent the three of us from Wheaton College. We don't represent Wheaton College. We don't speak for the school. We don't speak for all evangelicals. But I hope tonight you're hearing us represent some of the truths of the Christian faith, including our particular concern that Christian symbols, Christian language, and people who are influenced by conspiracy theories often spread in Christian contexts are necessary for us to speak up and to speak into. Now, we're not just going to hear from people at Wheaton College or people who are evangelicals, because again, we're all in this district together. And as we're in this district together, we want to hear from other leaders from other faiths. And the congressman is going to introduce them, and we're going to continue our conversation. And then I'll come back a little bit later on, and we're actually going to have our clergy. And now I want to encourage our clergy, you can begin to submit questions or think of questions, submit later in the program, and we'll open this conversation a little bit more. So I'm going to turn it back to Representative Casten, who's going to introduce our next guests.
Thank you, Dr. Stetzer and all of you. Now I'm going to introduce my friend Imam Hisham Al-Qaisi with the Islamic Foundation of Villa Park. Imam Al-Qaisi works closely with the youth at the Islamic Foundation. The youth love him. I can attest to that, having seen the joy that's over there. And this is vital work he's doing here in our community. Thank you, Imam Hisham, for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much for having me, and I pray that this is a blessed gathering, one that is witnessed above high upon high, and one that will grant us all with guidance. And I think as we're talking about moving forward, guidance is really what we need. Guidance for that which is best in this world, guidance for that which is best in the next, and guidance to follow really the footsteps of the greatest human beings to walk the face of the earth, the prophets of God, our prophet Jesus, peace and blessings be upon him, our prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, men who exemplified humanity. You know, in the Islamic faith, we think about what was the reason for these prophets walking this earth. Why were they human beings? So that they could teach us how to be human. In the Quran, it mentions that God could have sent angels to explain his book to us. But that wouldn't have been a practical example. We can't live up to the example of an angel because we're not angelic. We're human beings. We are prone to fault. And just as we are prone to fault, we are also welcome to seek forgiveness for those faults. And so we as human beings need to move forward with healing by seeking forgiveness and by asking God to protect us, by asking God to continue to guide us to look for the essence of humanity. We're human beings. As it was mentioned before, we all live in the same district. We see each other at the banks, at the grocery store. We drive past one another's. We use the same streets. Respecting one another's for the sake of humanity. Put aside political affiliation, religious affiliation, cultural, country of origin, language spoken, color of skin. None of that matters in front of God. Literally in the Quran, Allah says, the only thing that matters, that will differentiate a human being from another human being, is their closeness to God. And that's not something that comes with a label. That's not something that comes with a skin color. That's not something that comes with a socioeconomic status. That is not something that can be identified by another human being. So what choice do we have as humans? Is to respect one another. Is to know that I am no better than the person sitting next to me, or the person on the screen next to me here in this case. I'm no better than anyone else, nor is anyone better than me. I'm trying to do my job to get closer to God. The moment we let go of that, the moment we put that aside and start emphasizing those things that human beings think are important, but in reality have no importance whatsoever, the moment we start focusing on those, we've lost our focus. We need to get back to the essence. We need to get back on our connection with God. We need to get back on our connection with ourselves and seeking forgiveness from God for all of the sins and the mistakes that we have made in this world. And we need to find guidance. In the Quran, we say, Allahumma ihdina sirat al-mustaqim. Oh Allah, guide us to the straight path. This is a supplication. This is a supplication that we as Muslims make on a daily basis in every unit of prayer that we make. Guide us to the straight path. Not too far to the right, not too far to the left. Not to the path of those who incurred your anger, nor to those that were too hopeful in you, but we got to find a middle ground. And that's where we can meet. The middle ground is always, right, Franklin Roosevelt was it, who held the stick in the middle. You know, we have this in our American tradition, that you find the middle ground. You go too far one way or the other, physics is going to make you fall. That's how a seesaw works. You got to find the fulcrum. You got to find the center. And that center is with God. I pray that even in these times where we have been so distant from our houses of worship, and we may have even been distant from our faiths, knowing that faith is not restricted to a house of worship, that it's not restricted to a carpet and chandeliers and windows and walls, but perhaps in this time, and I know it at least in our community as well, many of us have stepped out of our faith, and many of our community members have lost our faith. We got to find it, and we have to connect with it, because God will be forever. Human beings will come and go. Our lifetime, our turns are limited, but God is forever. Let us connect with God. Let us invest in the hereafter, and let us pray for guidance. Allahumma ameen. I pray that Allah guides us to that which is best in this world and the next. And I thank all of the panelists, Representative Sean Casten, for this invitation. And again, I hope to continue to see what the rest of this conversation brings forward. And I thank all of our fellow panelists for their wonderful and beautiful thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Imam. I would now like to pass over to Associate Rabbi Frederick Ricky Camille with Congregation Etz Chaim. I think I first met you in Lombard after you held a youth event for the March for Our Lives event. I'd like to find opportunities to meet with you that are not after tragedies, but I appreciate your leadership and look forward to your comments.
Well, thank you, Representative for Casten, for having me, and thank you everyone here as well as being part of our panel, and everyone who is our clergy and everyone who might be watching on Facebook Live. And I started off in thinking about my remarks for this evening, asking the question that was posed to me: how did we get here? And the answer that I came to is we got here because of anger. And I want to explain a little bit about how, at least in this case, that anger, the reason why we were here, in some ways, the reasons why the storming of the Capitol happened 2 weeks ago was a very inappropriate anger. But I also think that perhaps the solution of how we can actually go forward is also in some anger as well, but a very different type of anger. And how I can actually explain that is in the Torah. In the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, we have a compliment that is given to God often, which is erech apayim, or someone who is slow to anger. Not necessarily someone who is never angry, but someone at least who has time to reflect, understand, and better be able to show that anger in more appropriate ways. And to look at the anger that I would say would be inappropriate is actually very well illustrated in this week's Torah portion, Bo. In Judaism, we have a different Torah portion that is read from the beginning to the end throughout the year. We are now kind of in the beginning, middle part of the book of Exodus, where we actually see a lot of anger coming from Pharaoh against the Israelites. So how does that anger work? First, I think we have a quote from the Talmud that talks about it's okay to be afraid. In fact, there are a lot of things in this world for which we need to be afraid, but excessive fear, especially fear that is made so people actually get angry and want to do something about, actually leads to sin. The particular sin, I believe, in the Talmud that's reflected is the violation of Shabbat, which is not necessarily what we're talking about here, but it shows that when we try to use fear as a motivator to bring people to be angry, that can become excessive very quickly and lead to sin. Another element that we have here is an entitlement. Pharaoh, I think, was very much entitled to having the Israelites as servants for him. And when there was an idea that they weren't going to be there anymore, this was met with much scorn, with much hatred, with much anger, directed right as the Israelites, because we are about to get to the apex of that story next week when we have the splitting of the Red Sea and the Israelites going through. But here is this kind of the apex of Pharaoh's anger happening in this week's Torah portion, Bo. And then finally, we get repetition. What do I mean by that? In the Torah, it says 5 times that God hardened Pharaoh's heart so that Pharaoh wouldn't let the Israelites go, and therefore a lot of punishments, a lot of plagues happened to Pharaoh. Now, we might look at that and say, But isn't that really God doing that, hardening Pharaoh's heart? Isn't that God, why wouldn't God soften Pharaoh's heart? But if we take a close look at the text, the first 5 times that it's mentioned that Pharaoh's heart is hardened, it's because Pharaoh hardened his own heart. And we can take from that a lesson that the more we respond with quick, hot anger, the more difficult it is to be able to actually remove ourselves from that. And that becomes just our natural response to it. However, as I mentioned, we also need to be angry as well. The things that we saw 2 weeks ago, the things that we're still continuing to see are things that should bring up our ire. It's things that perhaps we should be angry about. And what we're seeing is part of us, and that we should be, we shouldn't want to normalize it by not having a response to it. Again, another quote that we have from the Talmud: silence is beautiful for wise people, but it isn't even more beautiful for fools, or more beautiful for those who might actually be angry. However, this particular anger that I think could be something that brings unity is not anger at, but anger with. A call to empathy. A word that we have in Hebrew, rachamim, translated into English is usually something that we would say is compassion, is one of the most important words I think that we have. And it's this idea, if we look at the etymology of that, is that we're actually coming together and sharing suffering, sharing our passions, sharing the things which we rightfully have to be angry about. But it's not an individual anger. It's not a hot anger. It's not one that we act on right away, but one that we can talk with each other to find where are the issues in our society and be able to come together to actually solve them. Perhaps the most important commandment that we have in the Torah is ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, or love your neighbor as you would yourself. The rabbis take a long time asking what's the most important commandment. They never agree, but usually this one is always brought up in that argument. And I always have another translation for it. I won't bore you with the Hebrew on that, but it's actually act lovingly with your neighbor, whoever they may be, for they are just like you. And that is really, again, a call to empathy, to be able to share those passions together so that we can actually use that anger to be able to unite us to look and go towards a better world. So again, thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you, Rabbi Camille. Your comment about the right kind of anger. We were doing a Martin Luther King Day event yesterday, and was reminding people of his comments on the last speech, the mountaintop speech the day before his assassination. He said, "We need to lead with a dangerous unselfishness," and your remarks are reminding me of that. Our last formal speaker of the evening is the Right Reverend Chilton Knudsen. My friend, the assisting bishop for the Diocese of Washington, has been a bishop in the Episcopal Church, originally here in Illinois. Bishop Knudsen, look forward to your comments. Oh, and I think
we need to unmute yourself, Bishop.
That's going to be on sweatshirt sometime. Unmute yourself. I want to thank all of you who have spoken. Everything that has been said has been rich and valuable. It's had the radiance of truth. It comes from convictions that I can tell are deeply held by everyone. This is not a trivial conversation. This is a conversation in which we deeply invest. And amen to everything that's been said. I want to talk about universal common humanity. I think you're the one who first introduced the common humanity theme, Sean, in your opening remarks. I believe that if we go deep enough into the human experience, across cultures, across time, across geography, if we go deep enough, there are certain commonalities between us that for me are the place of hope. To discover those depths of common concern, of shared humanity, and how those shape the way we interact with each other is a fascination for me. I believe we act out of a very deep place in our humanity, and when we don't, we are being less authentic and less faithful, and we are also dangerous, dangerous. For example, one of the things that people do is accept the shorthand intellectual laziness of labeling, of labeling. So if you are a fill in the blank, then I can finish the rest of the story about who you are and what you value and how you are or are not going to be accommodating my viewpoint, etc. Labeling is cheap dismissal of someone's full humanity. And it's so common. Right now, labels get thrown around, and it's increasingly the war of labels. And by label, I don't just mean one word, but I mean a set of assumptions that goes with a particular way people describe other folks. And all of those assumptions, largely unchecked, largely not grounded in reality, feed like gas on a fire. They feed the feelings of alienation, the feelings of domination, the feelings of fear. So labeling is one thing I want to identify. It demonizes people. It fosters caricatures. It fosters all sorts of character assassinations. And I had a nun friend years ago who said, just remember, everything you're tempted to say about someone, you're saying about Jesus, because Jesus is present in every human being, according to my system of belief. The second thing I want to say is to celebrate and lift up another hopeful aspect for me, which is that people can change. People can change. In fact, if there was one thread, I think that is part of that common humanity of which I spoke, is a hunger for transformation, for things to get better, for my life to be more peaceful, more fruitful, more rewarding, more filled with grace and goodness. Transformation is possible. It tends to happen three ways. First, by example. When we see an example of someone whose life speaks to us about aspects, character we want that. That's an inspiration. That's one way we are undergoing transformation. The second way is what I call a process of enlightenment, where we kind of, in conversation with other people, in our own reflecting, meditating, learning, studying, we come to a vision of how we are called to be. And we seek ways to fulfill that vision. The third way of transformation is the way of suffering. It's the way that Jesus knows and shows. It's the way that all faiths acknowledge the reality in human life of suffering, of grief, of loss, of sadness, of pain at the ending of things we value and the loss of people we love. When there is that pain, it is such an opportunity for transformation. Such an opportunity for transformation. And nowadays, what is so easy to do is to feel the pain kind of nibbling at the edge of your consciousness and act out. And act out rather than taking in your experience, reflecting on it, learning from it, identifying. Transformation is possible. I've seen it in life after life, including in my own. And so that's a note of hope for me. People can change as they get new information, as they get new data. Many people have changed their minds about various key figures in this whole time in which we live. And it's a sign of health, and it's a sign of personhood to be able to change your mind when you're presented with new information. And thirdly, I wanted to say one thing, and that is, I hope we are not missing the lessons of this time. Anglicans in particular, lots and lots of other people, but Anglicans in particular, as I am one, have a model of life called action reflection. We've had action. People are taking action. What I'm looking for is a deep reflective commitment. How did we get here is a reflective question. What can we do to change and transform things is another reflective question. I so value the capacity to reflect, to be in serious and meaningful dialogue with other people. This is one example, but I would lift up, just in summary, labeling, transformation, all the ways the transformation takes place, and reflection. What can we learn? So thank you.
Indeed, thank you. And thank you for all of our panelists. You know, tonight a rabbi and a mom and a bishop walked into a congressman's Facebook Live. And Congressman learned a few things along with some of the professors. One of the things we learned is that preachers go longer than their allotted time. All of us have done that. And so that's one of the things that may be new news. We also learned, the Rabbi Camille mentioned Pharaoh. One of the things that all of us have in common, we all think Pharaoh is the bad guy. So just to kind of give everyone a sense that there's a consistency that's there. And other things we have in common is that we're all deeply concerned about the state of our nation, about representation of people of diverse religious backgrounds in our district and more. But one of the wonderful things we've been able to do too is we've invited other participants to come give their questions. So you're part of the conversation. We know the conversation has been quite excited on Facebook Live. I've been looking at it on a screen to my left, but also want to thank our panelists and then open to questions as well. Now, many of our clergy participants are able to put questions through WebEx. And so if you'll go ahead and begin to do that now, I can call on you and you will actually be able to put you live here on the screen as well. Those of you who are watching on Facebook Live, please continue to do so. And do me a favor and take a moment and like and share so people can know the conversation that we're having here today. So I'm looking for some questions here. I see one has come through already, and I'll share that, but I only see one. So I know we have 22 plus participants, different clergy representation, people of faiths, different faiths, and in some cases of no faith, to be able to share. But one question is, I would love the panelists to talk about the use or misuse of the religious category of forgiveness in a socio-political sense. What does it mean to forgive one another coming out of the events of January 6th? What would that forgiveness look like? And so what I'm going to do is going to pass this to a couple of people in different traditions. And I do want to ask you to keep your answers brief so that we can get as many questions as we can. And while we're addressing that question, if others of you are participating on WebEx, you can put that question there as well. So if you don't mind, let's first go to Rabbi Camille and ask how he might respond. And then if someone else wants to answer, just kind of jump in right after him. Go ahead.
So thank you for the question. So I think forgiveness can be an important tool in moving forward. However, I think sometimes forgiveness gets caught up in an idiom, forgive and forget, which I always like to use a different one that we could try. Sorry, excuse me. Sorry, something stuck in my throat there.
There's no worries at all. We've seen Marco Rubio do that on national television, so you're doing just fine.
Well, thank you. Redeem and remember. So forgiveness best works when there's an effort from the party that was the original offender in actually working on what it was that they did and are in some ways redeemed, that they're able to work on themselves so that if they were presented with the same set of circumstances, they would choose a different outcome that was the original offense that happened. And also it's important to remember to make sure that we are able to go forward smartly as we can learn from our history. So instead of, I would say, I think again, forgiveness is important, but it comes with that redemption in person that did the offense is actually working on themselves, and that we remember it so that we can learn from it in the future as well. Not, in so much that it's going to make it so that there's always, depending on what that offense was, there are some really terrible things that people do, but that they are, always at that they could never be up to the same level again. But yeah, so I would say forgiveness is important, but there always needs to be a effort from the offending party to change, and then we move forward.
Good deal. I want to see maybe one other person might weigh in on that. And I've been told they're helping me a little bit on our tech side on the attendee list that I can see when you raise your hand. So if you raise your hand, I can actually call on you, put you on video if you'd like to do that as well. And if our tech team, if I'm doing that incorrectly, just don't hesitate to let me know. But who among our current panelists here would like to also answer that question briefly? Just go ahead and unmute yourself and we'll, Michael, I see you going ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on that one just because I teach on the concept of forgiveness quite a bit in some of my classes. And there's so much that can be said about that. I think Rabbi Ricky hit really one of the key elements, which is that how can, forgiveness should be part of change. I think it's also, I want to add what forgiveness doesn't exclude, which is justice. I think a lot of times we think forgiveness means, and therefore, like for instance, if we forgive, there is no jail sentence. If we forgive, there is no impeachment. And I think you can forgive in saying that I no longer hold the anger against you. I don't have no desire to see you, hurt or injured. There's also a requirement, both personal, emotional, and communally for justice. One of the books I assign and students love is the book Just Mercy, and by Brian Stevenson. And one of the things I emphasize to students when we read that book, most of the people discussed in that book are guilty. Right? They've committed a crime. Justice is necessary. But how do we go about justice? Do we go about justice for vengeance and hatred, or do we seek justice for a social societal building up? So I think forgiveness is a very good thing, but forgiveness does not obviate justice. Justice is necessary. And in the midst of justice, it is wonderful to forgive.
Okay, excellent, excellent. So at this point, I want to ask that if you, because we really want to get someone on screen to share, if you'll indicate that you have a question. I think you'll be able to raise hand. If you're in the WebEx, I know folks are also engaging in on Facebook Live, and we're thankful for that conversation. Let's go first and we're going to put you on the screen here. So Michael Metto, you're up next, and we'll put you live on the screen.
Thank you very much. The question that we are facing is, where do we go from here? That's really the more important part of what we are looking for. So mine isn't really a question, it is more of a statement. I remember reading some time ago that as Christians, we also believe in forgiveness. But forgiveness is by no means synonymous with ignoring justice. Forgiveness ensures that our own hearts are not entangled in a web of anger and resentment, or corrupted by feelings of hatred or revenge. Forgiveness is ultimately liberating and empowering, but at the same time, justice is essential, not for the purposes of punishment, but to secure and protect our societies in which the people must respectfully live side by side. That is why the Glen Ellyn Interfaith Prayer Committee for the last 5 years has been bringing people together to pray and understand each other at the same time. We recognize that we live in very troubled times, so we offer hope that through our combined prayers, we will be able to reflect our nation's desire that all people are created equal. Aspiring to live this truth, Glen Ellyn, as well as many other communities, strives to be an all-inclusive community which champions diversity, embraces its immigrant communities, respects sexual and gender identity, makes room for all faiths, pursues equity, and rejects hatred, violence, and terrorism. We need to pray a lot.
Thank you, Michael.
Forgive a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Good. Somebody else would like to, if you'd raise your hand, I can call on you and we can unmute you. So give us a second to respond to that. I don't see another hand right now, but we'll give it just a moment. In the meanwhile, we'll wait for another hand. Bishop, would you mind just sort of reflecting a little bit too on some of that call to unity and to respect different peoples as well? You got to unmute yourself. There you go.
I did. Two things come to my mind quickly. One is that respect is a complicated, sort of many-layered word, but it has to do, in the end, for me, in recognizing the full and precious humanity of another person. It's the opposite of labeling. So that's one reflection, is if we can come together and share our common humanity, respect is the natural outgrowth of that. Second thing to say is forgiveness and justice and God's righteousness are all very important to me. And one of the things that I would add on to the comments that have been made so far is that it is our duty to call out wrong, to stand up and name it honestly, to seek justice as best human beings can understand justice. Those are some thoughts.
Good. Thank you for adding to that conversation as well. Let's give one more chance of an opportunity for anyone who's in our WebEx conversation who'd like to raise a hand. We can actually invite you to and unmute you, but we'll give you just a minute. We have different faith traditions represented there as well, and but sometimes people can be a little reticent to jump in, particularly when they're not as familiar with the medium. Okay, I don't see anybody else doing so. So I think what we'll do then is we'll kind of move to some of our concluding remarks as well. And the Representative Casten asked me to say a few words, and then he's going to say a few words at the end. I'm just going to take one more look and see if there's anybody there with a hand raised. I don't see anybody else with a hand raised.
Dr. Stetzer,
yes, sir,
Sue Allen would like to ask a question.
Please. I don't see that hand, but go ahead and do that. I'm not sure where she is, but go ahead, Sue.
Hi, I'm a pastor at Church in Bartlett, and one of the things I'm a chaplain for the fire district there, and I think although we are so quickly wishing it could be over and we could move ahead, one of the things that I think we need to recognize is the fact that we are dealing with these local events on top of an already and ongoing tragedy of the pandemic. Normally we referenced at the beginning of this 9/11 or Pearl Harbor or some type of event. Those were events that happened, which were tragic, but they were over in a short time period. We've been dealing with the tragedy of the pandemic for almost a year now. And this ongoing trauma that we are in has caused a lot of fatigue on everyone's part. So it's fatigue from all of the clergy who've had to try and adjust to different ways of being church or being synagogue or being any kind of faith community. Adjust our students. We've had to adjust educational systems, shopping, everything else. And now we're tired of all that. And on top of that, we get this and we're like, can't we just move ahead? Where do we go from here? We need to recognize it's going to take time. Because if we rush too quickly into whatever solution we deem is there, it will not be a long-lasting solution. Rush quickly into forgiveness, and we do forget that justice piece. We forget about the fact that there has to be some kind of responsibility taken. Rush too quickly into a solution, and we will not have thought clearly about the consequences involving everyone. For everyone created in the image of God. Mm. So I think that all of these things, we need to look at our context all the time. And our context is we're already in the midst of a traumatic situation, which is ongoing. Yeah. We have heaped on top of that the events of January 6th.
Yeah. It is indeed, and Sue Allen, you're right on, is a stunning time and a time to remind even people who might be watching here that issues of mental health are real, and there are places to reach out to. People of faith might reach out to their clergy and others, connecting to social services in the community and more. And this is a remarkably difficult time. And yet, in the midst of this, in the midst of the greatest global crisis in our lifetime, we see the breaching of the Capitol on the news and more. So, good word from Sue Allen. I think we're going to have Inamul Haq. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Please forgive me if I'm not. But if you, I think you can. We'll even be able to see you on camera, is what they're telling me. So let's put you on camera, and you go ahead.
Thank you very much for having me and for a wonderful talk. I think that what happened on January 6th was in the making for a long time. And we are genuinely worried that the consequences will be with us for a long time. I do have one concern because of my own experience, my origin in Pakistan, and what I witnessed, that how the militancy can connect itself with broader political movement, and then political movement can connect itself with religion and create a web which becomes very hard to untangle. I think one of the key problems we are facing at this moment is America's identity crisis. Since the dawn of modern state in 16th, 17th century, modern state always defined itself in light of an ethnic group and a religious identity. You are France when you are French and you are Christian and post-Christian. You are Indian when you are Indian and you are Hindu. You are Turkish when you are Turk and you are Sunni Muslim. You are an Iranian when you are Persian and you are Shia Muslim. So there is always a religious and spiritual identity along with ethnic identity. And it plays a very key role in the formation of a nation. And I think that America is at that moment where it thinks that our ethnic identity of being white American and religious identity of being Christian is threatened. And that is creating a certain tribalist response and a desire to go into our own cocoon and defend what we think is legitimately ours. So I think this is a very complex question, that if we as a nation are not Christian and not white, then what we are. What is the basis of our national identity? And how do we articulate that identity for our generations? I think that is a very, very deep question where religion and education both are very important to answer it.
It's good. Helpful question and comment. Let me just say, as a white Christian, that my hope is that America is a place for you and for all different kinds of people of different religions, backgrounds, contexts, and more. But let me also see if a couple of our panelists want to weigh in. If you'll unmute yourself, we've got to keep our answers somewhat short, but a couple of our panelists like to weigh in. I'm looking for unmutings, and I'll throw it to you. Michael McCoy, I want to ask you, because I want us to talk a little bit about pluralism and the place that plays in our democracy. So let's throw it to you first.
Just general comments or a particular question?
No, just in reference to his comment about what the place is for a person who's a person of color, other background, other religion.
You know, as he was speaking, I was, you know, my own comments when I talked about loss of cultural power, I thought a lot about how to integrate, how do we think about loss of, for lack of a better phrase, how do we think about loss of racial power? And I think it's difficult not to talk about that too in this conversation. That I'll just talk personal. I'll start with if you want me to be brief. So seeing that comment, seeing the mob particularly attacked the black cop, it led to a visceral reaction in me as I watched it. And I couldn't think of the history of white mob violence against African Americans. I think one of the reckonings we have in our country is what will we do with the fact that this country is trending towards not majority white and to be plurality white. And to how we think about pluralism, democracy, there's a great article in Atlantic. It repeated something I've been feeling for a long time. We have been a multiracial democracy, not for 200 plus years, but for 50 years, right? Or for 50 plus years since the Voting Rights Act. The question we have to ask ourselves is, will the Voting Rights Act stand? Right? We're still at a place where the Voting Rights Act is under assault. It has not been renewed by Congress. They're trying to put the name John Lewis on it to give it greater validity because of the heroism of John Lewis. Is America ready to commit to a fully multiracial democracy? Let's acknowledge right now, that's still up for debate. And that assault on the Capitol, right? When you had senators say, I trust the vote in Arizona, but I don't trust it in Philadelphia, that was an attack on black votes. And so I think that has to be a major part of this conversation. And I'm glad it was brought up, because race can be a difficult thing to talk about. But we have to ask, are we committed to a multiracial democracy? I hope we are, but time will tell, because it's historically new.
Yes, good word. I've been kind of sent a note that we need to wrap up, and they've asked me to say a few closing words. By the way, that's Eugene Goodman, was the African-American police officer who was such a hero, 101st Airborne veteran as well, and thankful for his work and service. So we've gathered together, different faith leaders, had some important conversations. We come from different traditions with a common country that we care about, a common district that we live in. Representative Casten, thank you for inviting us to this conversation. I would we have a tradition in my own faith tradition about speaking prophetically in a moment. And part of what we need to do as Christians, evangelical Christians and others, is to speak prophetically to our own tradition, but also speak prophetically to leaders like you, Representative Casten. I'm thankful that you would have us, but let's continue this conversation. You're probably, just seeing the response on your Facebook page, and I have trolls just like you have trolls, but the emails I've gotten today, why would you talk to Representative Casten? There are a lot of people of faith, based on the comments we've seen, who maybe see in some ways you as maybe not pro-faith or even anti in some ways. Particularly some of the things, and I know you want to make sure that people of no faith and secular people have an important place, and I do too, in our democracy. But let's continue this conversation so that people of faith can build that bridge. I noticed that you know the rabbi, the imam, and the bishop, but some of us in the evangelical tradition may be new as friends, and let's find ways to connect and to. I would love to. In your district, you have some of the most influential churches in America, and you've got little churches which haven't had worship services in 9 months that now have turned their facilities into food pantries and are ministering to their communities, and many different evangelical groups doing that as well. I would love to, and you have my contact information, of course, but I would love to sit down, get some of them together with you, so you'll get to know some of them a little bit better as well. We're all going to have to tone down the rhetoric. I'm going to speak to my constituents. I think the reason you invited me to host this is you read my article in USA Today or my time on NPR's Morning Edition talking about some of those things. I think ultimately we're all going to have to tone down that rhetoric. I know you're a puncher. I see you being a puncher online, and I get it. I'm subtle as a ton of bricks, as my colleagues at Wheaton College will tell you. But when it comes to things of faith, we want to be able to speak respectfully, people of faith and people of no faith. And you've heard evangelicals tonight speak into our constituents, and we're doing that elsewhere. Let's build some bridges and help connect you to know some of the evangelical and you've already done that in other contexts, but in other contexts as well. But let me just say, I know that it cost you some things to have Ed Stetzer and Wheaton College faculty here among your constituents. And it cost us some things, but it cost you some things. It's on your page. And I thank you for inviting us and letting us be a part of this conversation. Again, thanks to our panelists. Thanks to those of you who joined us. Those of you still on Facebook Live, do it one more time, like and share so people are aware of the conversation tonight. I think it's been helpful. And back to you. And again, thanks to you, Representative Casten.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. This is truly the great joy and the great privilege of this job is that you get to meet diverse people and learn from them. And I've been sitting here scribbling notes as we go through, trying to figure out how to tie all these threads together. And I want to do my best, but it'll be flawed because I'm just a flawed mortal like the rest of us. I first want to respond to what Inamul said. I think I challenge you a little bit that we are one of the few, certainly the first country that was not founded on the idea of ethnicity or a spiritual tie to our geography. Now, to be honest, somebody had quoted Brian Stevenson. Brian Stevenson is the first to point out we were founded on a genocide. And that's why our founding tradition is not tied to people who have a spiritual tie to the land, because we killed them. The path we got there is not a proud path. But that doesn't change the fact that there's a nobility and a beauty in the fact that we do have a country that is predicated on the idea that we are all created equally, that our common unity is what matters. And I think I speak to all of you, and I mean this genuinely. The best leader in the world is someone who encourages somebody to see a path that they might not otherwise take. But you still have to take the first step. The leader doesn't drag you. And I have certainly learned a lot, and I hope that the folks who are listening here have seen a door to take some first steps, because as I said in my opening remarks, this is not about what we do as politicians. It's not about what we do from our respective pulpits. It's about what everybody who is listening here does to try to heal and move forward in this moment. If you wait for it, as my daughters will periodically say as we drive around town, they should really fix that. And my wife and I like to say, who is they? Right? You should fix that. One of my colleagues who's very famous, and so I will not say his name because that will cause you to color, maybe depending on your politics, color your judgment. But he has this beautiful saying that he says that at core we're a nation of magnets. And because of our diversity, because of all the richness of the traditions we come from, we have all these little magnets that pull us together. Our churches, our synagogues, our mosques, our clubs, our PTA associations. And there's always a temptation for us to be drawn closer to the magnet and away from our common humanity. And his observation was that you don't notice the magnets when things are easy, but you notice the magnets when things are hard. Reverend Knudsen, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of pain in the world right now, and there's an opportunity for us to learn from suffering. We've lost 400,000 American souls to COVID. We're in a massively deep downturn. The unemployment rate for the bottom quartile of the economy is higher than it was in the Great Depression right now. Massive mental health issues, as you talked about, Dr. Stetzer. Widening wealth inequality. And in those moments, what my colleague said was that the easiest political tool you have, not just if you're a politician, the easiest political tool you have is to tell people that their pain is caused by people who don't look or think like them. Encourage you to flock to that magnet because there's so much comfort in that magnet. It's the tool of the demagogue. And our challenge for how we find unity in this moment is to reject that and to recognize that everything we've truly ever been proud of as a country is when somebody has encouraged us to take that step towards our common humanity and focus on those things that unite us rather than divide us. And all of you are just as tempted by those magnets. You're tempted by the Facebook circles you live in. You're tempted by who you amplify on your social media feeds. And frankly, in this quarantined COVID moment, we're all spending way too much time with people who think and feel and act and eat and worship a lot like we do. And so I hope as we come through this and think about how to heal from this more quickly than we healed from Fort Sumter, that all of us recognize a collective need to take the wisdom on this call and no matter how empathetic we are, recognize we haven't been exercising that muscle as much as we should have. So listen a little longer, be a little more tolerant, reach out across. I will definitely take you up on your offer, Dr. Stetzer and all of the rest of you as well. Insist on accountability, but lead with love. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman.
So much.
Thank you.